Recently, the Palm Springs Kiwanis Club had another great speaker. Let's listen in.
We talk about the expansion of the country and all the covered wagons lurching west, and how many movies have there been made about the land rush and all of that. And if you strip down the history of the last 150 years of this country, and you take out the wars, which are a little difficult to do, but if you can do that, what is left is the expansion of this country. The fact that Arizona and New Mexico did not become states until after 1900. We have a hard time thinking of that. That the Cherokee Strip land rush was 1893, which was very close to the Teddy Roosevelt era and the coming of the new century. It is, of course, the promise of speed and getting from here to there with an automobile that really began to move the country. One of the things that helped out with the automobile was better engines. That was the real problem. Tires were rather in development in 1900, but what they needed was a decent engine. A car made it from New York to San Francisco in 1906 took 71 days to go from New York to San Francisco in 1906. And the reason was there were no roads. We had in this country a disconnected set of farm ruts. And that's one reason why no one went very far from home. Unless you were a legislator or a judge or a doctor, you never went more than about 15 or 20 miles in your entire life from where you lived. In 1919, the government wanted to see how bad the roads were for military reasons. So they sent a convoy of trucks from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, following the route of a road that hadn't been built yet. It was the proposed Lincoln Highway, which would connect east and west. It took a very long time for them to get across the country, 3,251 miles, 81 motorized vehicles. They had to move trees and build bridges because of the weight of some of the military vehicles. 62 days, and a very young officer named Dwight Eisenhower was part of that group, and he learned an awful lot from that. Of course, he would later go to Europe for a very obvious reason, and he would see the Autobahns in Germany. They were about 20 years ahead of us over there in road building. And many people say the Autobahns are much, much better than anything we've ever built as far as an interstate highway. But a lot of towns started asking themselves, when are we going to be connected to the next city? When are you going to straighten out the old roads? We all know Rand McNally. They put out wonderful maps, but Rand and McNally were photographers to start with. And they would go to an intersection and photograph it and put out an atlas of photos. And one of the most remarkable ones is south of Washington, D.C., there was a barn. And they had put out a photo album on how to get from Washington, D.C. to Richmond. And it says, this barn is 6 miles south of Arlington, Virginia. It is red. When you get to it, take the second rut to the right. That is what we had back then. When it was dry, the dust flew. When it was wet, your tires stuck in the mud. But these were the only roads we had. People knew that something had to be done about this because more and more wealthy people were buying automobiles and they wanted to go out on junkets. And you've probably seen old films of people in those cars just bouncing up and down, wearing what were called dusters over them to keep the dust off their very expensive clothing. What we needed was a new national road, and one of the first lobbying groups was AAA, which was started in Pennsylvania, but grew exponentially here in the state of California. It would actually, though, begin in the 1920s. The first numbered highway systems were laid out in 1926, with the major highways being US 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and then the north-south were odd numbers. And if you think about this, US 50 went through my hometown. It also was a block from where I lived in D.C., right across the U.S., and that awful section in northern Nevada through Ely is called the loneliest road in the United States. If you've ever driven it, it's like going across the Mojave through Amboy to get to Las Vegas. There is nothing out there. US 1 was on the East Coast, ran down through Maine, Boston, and D.C., and 99 was on the West Coast. So it was a sensible numbering system. The first transcontinental railroad came through in 1869. Lincoln had thought it was important enough to link the East and the West that even when our resources were being depleted during the Civil War, he did two things. He said, continue to rebuild the Capitol building, put a new dome on it. Because the original dome on the Capitol building looked fine when the Capitol building was this wide. But as they knew the country was going to expand, they added a House and a Senate side, and the old dome looked like a pimple on top of it. So the dome we see today was started in the Lincoln era. Lincoln thought it was important to keep building it as a sign of the Union, but also to continue the transcontinental railroad. Nothing in the history of this country changed America more than the transcontinental railroad. You see, the railroads were given tens of thousands of acres of land. For every mile they built, they were given a square mile of land on either side, every other mile, which is what resulted in this checkerboard pattern we have out here that's American Indian land and non-Indian land. By the 1880s, the railroads were offering last-class passage for $1 to get west. They wanted immigrants to move and start towns on their property. And that was the driving incentive of the railroads, which of course were about the greediest people in the history of the country. There were a lot of roads early on that went into the prairie, and the first interstate highway was started during the Jefferson administration. We know it now as the Old National Road. It's US 40 in the East Coast, and going from Washington, D.C. back to Indiana, I probably traveled it far too many times. 40 was supposed to go to St. Louis. In 1837, we went through our first depression in this nation. They stopped it at Vandalia, Illinois, an hour from St. Louis today. There was a joke there, and that is the wagon masters would promise to take people for a certain amount of money from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia and drop them off not in Vandalia, Illinois, but in Vandalia, Ohio, along the way. And people would say, what is this? Where am I? And they say, well, we only told you we were taking you to Vandalia. Today, it is a far northern suburb of Dayton, Ohio, and it came from out of nowhere specifically because the wagon masters dropped people off too early. There are still preserved inns along the National Road. There's the Castleman Inn in Grantsville, Maryland, which is owned by a Mennonite couple now. And anytime you go in there, you smell bread baking. There's also an old bridge built in 1813 across the Castleman River that had an 80-foot arch, which at the time was the longest arch ever built. It stayed as part of US 40 until 1942, carrying traffic across there. Brownsville, Maryland was a wonderful city on 40. But in my high school years, I remember we went east, and there was a lot of construction there. The Pennsylvania State Department of Highways decided that wonderful Brownsville, Maryland, sitting down in a valley with the first steel bridge in the United States, they built a bridge over the top of the city. And within 10 years, Brownsville had died. The downtown section of Brownsville, which is a curving old right-of-way along the river, is completely boarded up. It's one of the saddest things you ever want to see. A city of 20,000 people with absolutely no downtown anymore. Wheeling, West Virginia, along 40, became the site of the first suspension bridge of its size in the U.S. It was built before the Civil War, and it's still being used. It was built, partially designed by the Roeblings, who would go on to build the Brooklyn Bridge. One of my favorite parts of Old Highway 40 is several sections of the old road in Ohio, perfectly preserved, that are brick. I remember going up into the Maryland mountains and going to the old right-of-way of the National Road, digging down through the asphalt and finding brick underneath. Can you imagine how labor-intensive it was for a row of men standing side by side by side, bending over, laying bricks that weighed 12 pounds each? That's what we don't realize, probably never think about paving bricks, but these things were bulky, wonderful pieces, and of course that's how they first paved the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. All of that was brick, and that's why we call it the Old Brickyard. But when you think of old highways, you don't think of Highway 40, you think of 66. Yep. Why is Route 66 so immortalized? I was in Amboy 2 weeks ago, and there was a busload of German tourists there. And on many parts of Old 66, they have painted the shield for 66. And these Germans were doing selfies of themselves and Route 66. And I asked this young man, why are you so crazy about Route 66? He said it connects east and west. He said, we can't have that in Germany. Our country's not big enough. He said, only in the U.S. could you have a single highway that long. And of course, there is still a great fascination among many Europeans about the Old West. And the other thing is, they don't have anything that big, that expansive, that wide. I was at the Grand Canyon one time, and there was an elderly Japanese couple there, and the woman was sobbing. And the husband came over to apologize for that display of emotion. He said, we have never seen anything this big. Well, one of my favorite stories is about when they were building 66, and not to get ahead of myself, but something you have to realize is almost every important highway got there because of the railroad. Railroads can't do this. They have to keep the same grade going up and down a hill. So the highway engineers thought, you know, if the railroad engineers have done all this work, why don't we just put a highway beside it? Go down I-10 and realize that when at one time it was US 99, US 60, and US 90 going through that little narrow funnel through our valley, it was there because the railroad was there first. There was a railroad camp in a ponderosa pine forest in Arizona, and they were trying to get workers from the east, so they sent out flyers. Come to our little camp. They had stripped all the bark off a ponderosa pine tree, and one of the members of the camp had his wife with him, and she made this enormous Stars and Stripes. And they put it up, and the flyer said, look for the Stars and Stripes. A month later, a storm blew the Stars and Stripes down, and the next flyer said, our American symbol may be gone, but you can still find the Flagstaff. And that's how Flagstaff, Arizona got started. There are so many stories along old roads. There are ghosts there. If you've ever been on the switchback in the Rockies, if you've ever traveled down the East Coast, you have to realize that we have gone from dirt to planks to gravel to brick to asphalt to concrete. And all of that has kept us going and expanding as a nation. And the next time you drive down a highway and you get a little angry because of the chuck holes and the fact that, yes, we built the interstate system, but we never earmarked enough money to take care of it, realize the fact that we take for granted today something that is space age compared to what our grandparents had. Going from place to place didn't used to be a treat, it was a trek. I'm going to go later, right after this, to take a friend to the airport in Ontario. Do you know how long it would have taken to have driven to Ontario in 1910? You probably would have stayed somewhere along the way, but I'm going to go over there and come back and work on some stuff and have supper and go to a Kiwanis meeting and eat breakfast at McDonald's and file an obituary on the internet about a woman I know who died and put the audio in there all in one day and probably go to bed tonight. We take too much for granted, and I hope you'll realize that one of those things is our highways. We shouldn't take them for granted because the pioneers had it tough. And no matter how bad traffic is today, we have it easy, actually. Thank you very much.
For more, go to KIWANISPalmSprings.org.